The night was alive with laughter, the usual carefree sounds of a sleepover. For friends, Jesse, Lily, Emma, and Ryan had gathered in Jesse's house. An old two-story with creaky floorboards and a story behind every wall. The walls of her bedroom were draped with fairy lights, casting soft, warm glows. Laughter bounced off the walls, and the faint sound of music played from a laptop in the corner. It should have been an ordinary evening, but as the clock ticked past midnight, a shift began to happen, subtle at first, unnoticed by most of the group. Jessie, a bubbly yet introspective girl, felt a strange unease ripple through her chest. It started with the phone. A simple landline, ancient, sitting on the desk by the window, untouched by modernity. Jessie had forgotten to disconnect it, a relic of her family's old-school ways. When it rang, it startled her. She hadn't expected anyone to call at this hour. She hesitated, glancing at her friends, who were lost in conversation. "Who's calling at this hour?" Jessie muttered to herself, but curiosity got the better of her. She picked up the receiver, pressing it to her ear. "Hello." Her voice was shaky, a slight tremble of nerves she couldn't explain. A long silence answered her, stretching out like a dark tunnel. Then, she heard it. A whisper, soft and barely audible. "Jessie." She froze, her pulse racing in her ears. Her friends didn't notice her reaction, still laughing and chatting away. "Must be a prank," she told herself. But then the voice came again, clearer this time, more deliberate. "I know you're there." Jessie's heart skipped a beat. She pulled the phone from her ear, glancing nervously at the group. No one seemed to be paying attention. Her palms were clammy now, the warmth of the room suddenly oppressive. She shakily returned the phone to her ear. "Who is this?" she asked, trying to sound braver than she felt. There was a long pause before the voice replied, "It's not who I am that matters. It's who you are." The words made no sense, yet they sent a cold shiver down her spine. Her grip tightened on the receiver, her mind racing. She tried to look around the room. Nothing seemed out of place, but a creeping sensation was spreading inside her. The others were still absorbed in their own world, oblivious to the chilling moment she was experiencing alone. "What do you want?" Jessie's voice was barely above a whisper, and the very act of speaking seemed to trigger something in the air around her. The laughter from her friends suddenly grew distant, muffled, as if an invisible barrier was slowly separating her from them. A heavy silence hung in the room, and then, the voice on the other end of the line answered her again, this time in a lower, almost sinister tone. "You shouldn't be alone, Jessie. You never were." Jessie's hand shook, the phone slipping slightly in her grip. She didn't recognize the voice, but there was something familiar about it, something unsettling. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up as she turned her attention back to her friends, wondering if they had heard. But no, they hadn't. It was as if the room had shifted, as though time itself had slowed down in that one moment. Her breathing quickened, and she nearly dropped the phone in panic when she heard the voice one last time, saying her name, "Jessie." The voice was cold, eerily calm. Jessie instinctively pulled the receiver away from her ear, staring at the device with wide eyes. The line was dead. She stood motionless for a long moment, staring at the phone in her hand, unable to process what had just happened. The air in the room felt suddenly heavy, and Jessie was acutely aware of every creak in the old house around her. The unease that had begun to stir within her grew into something more, an all-encompassing dread. "Jessie!" Lily's voice snapped her out of her trance. Jessie blinked, slowly turning toward her. Lily was standing beside her, concern in her eyes. "Are you okay?" Lily asked, her tone confused but caring. Jessie opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The room felt colder now, and she was unsure if it was the air conditioning or something far more sinister. I'm fine," Jessie finally stammered, forcing a smile onto her face, even though it felt unnatural. She placed the receiver back in its cradle, but her heart still raced, and her mind couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. But the moment passed, and Jessie told herself it was nothing. Just a prank. The others went back to their games, and the laughter resumed. But Jessie couldn't focus. She kept glancing at the phone, her mind racing with thoughts of the voice. There was something too real about it. Something too precise. It wasn't just a prank. Whoever had called knew things they shouldn't have. And they were watching her. She tried to shake the feeling, but as she sat back down with her friends, her eyes kept darting back to the old phone by the window. And deep down, Jessie knew it wouldn't be the last time it rang. It was nearly 1:30 a.m., the hour when the world outside seemed to disappear, and the only sounds were the ones within the walls of the old house. Jessie, still rattled by the phone call, was having a hard time shaking the nagging sense that something was wrong. She glanced around the room, where her friends were still gathered in small clusters, chatting, playing games, and laughing. The light from the fairy lights flickered slightly as the hum of the air conditioning added a soft, almost comforting buzz in the background. But something in the stillness of the room felt too quiet. Mia, the quiet, withdrawn girl in the group, sat on the edge of the bed, her face half hidden behind the pages of a book. She was often the outsider, the one who didn't quite belong with the rest, and tonight that isolation seemed to be more pronounced. Mia had always been fascinated by the old house, its creaky floors and narrow hallways filled with forgotten stories. While the others were content to stay in the comfort of Jessie's room, Mia found herself drawn to the rest of the house, yearning for a space that was all her own, a place that felt far away from the laughter and light. As she slipped out of the room, unnoticed, the door creaked closed behind her, and the sudden silence felt almost like a promise. She wasn't used to being around so many people, and tonight the noise felt too much to bear. She needed air. She needed space. She wandered down the narrow hall, the old wood groaning beneath her feet as she walked, each step accompanied by the dull thudding of her pulse. Her footsteps echoed in the empty hallway, a stark contrast to the sounds of chatter from the room behind her. The house had a strange energy, a mix of comfort and foreboding. The walls, lined with peeling wallpaper and old family portraits, seemed to watch her as she passed. As she reached the staircase, Mia hesitated, her gaze drifting upward to the attic door. It was always locked, but tonight, something felt different. She felt an inexplicable pull, a need to go up there, to see what had always been hidden from view. The attic door was small, tucked away at the top of the stairs, as though it had been forgotten by time. The doorknob was old-fashioned, brass, and worn, its edges dulled from years of use. The lock was simple but sturdy, just a small metal latch that held it closed. Mia could feel a strange anticipation in the air, like the house itself was waiting for her to discover something. Taking a deep breath, she pulled at the latch. The door creaked open slowly, the sound piercing the silence. Dust and stale air rushed out, and the faint scent of old wood and forgotten things filled her nose. Mia stepped inside, her flashlight casting long, eerie shadows on the walls. The space was cramped, with boxes piled high and cobwebs stretching across every corner. It felt like stepping into a different time, a world that had been left behind. As she walked deeper into the attic, Mia's flashlight flickered, casting fleeting shadows on the walls. The attic seemed to stretch on endlessly, filled with forgotten relics of the past. Old furniture, trunks filled with clothes, and strange objects she couldn't quite identify littered the floor. Her eyes were drawn to an old chest in the far corner, its wood warped with age. She slowly moved toward it, her heartbeat quickening with each step. When she knelt down to open the chest, a chill ran through her, though the air in the attic was thick and warm with dust. The lid creaked as she lifted it, revealing a tangle of old dolls and fabric. As she sifted through the items, she found a small, yellow journal tucked beneath the toys. It looked old, too old, like it had been there for decades. The leather binding was cracked and faded, and the pages within were fragile, their edges curling with age. Mia opened the journal carefully, her fingers brushing over the delicate paper. The first entry was dated nearly 50 years ago, written in neat, childlike handwriting. The words seemed innocent enough at first, recounting daily activities, playing in the yard, eating meals with family, and running through the woods. But as Mia turned the pages, The entries grew darker. The friend came again today. The writing was more erratic now, as if the writer was growing fearful of something. Mia's breath caught in her throat as she continued reading. I don't know where she comes from. She's always there when I'm alone. She says she'll never leave me. Mia's fingers shook as she turned to the next page. The entries became more disturbing. The writing was messy, as though the child was scribbling in fear. The friend says she'll stay with me forever. She says we'll never be alone again. Mia closed the journal, her hands trembling. She sat back, her eyes wide with confusion and fear. Who was this child? And who was the friend? The silence in the attic felt oppressive now, as though the walls themselves were listening. She felt the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. It was then that she heard it. A soft scuffling sound behind her, like something dragging across the floor. Her heart lurched in her chest. She turned quickly, her flashlight beam sweeping across the attic. For a moment, there was nothing, just the dim, dust-filled air. But then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, small, hunched over, moving swiftly in the shadows. A child? No, it was too dark to tell. But the movement was unmistakable. The figure stopped just out of the light's reach, its presence unnerving, like it was waiting for her to acknowledge it. Mia's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The figure didn't move, just stood there in the darkness, watching her. And then, with a sudden jerk, it darted across the attic, vanishing into the shadows. Mia's body froze. She couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, trying to process what she had seen. But there was no denying it. There was something in the attic. With a sharp intake of breath, Mia stood up, her legs shaky beneath her. The chest was left open, the journal still sitting on the floor, but she couldn't stay in this room any longer. She had to leave. As she rushed toward the door, her heart pounding, the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. Faint, but unmistakable. Someone or something was following her. The laughter from the others downstairs began to fade, drowned out by the pounding in Emma's ears. She stood alone in the hallway, staring at the darkened door to the guest room. The soft glow from the hallway light barely penetrated the shadows, casting long, shifting silhouettes along the walls. There was something unsettling about this room, something that had always felt off. Emma couldn't put her finger on it, but tonight, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling to her. She had always been the brave one, the one who kept everyone calm when the lights flickered and strange noises echoed through the old house. But now, as she stood there, the usual confidence she carried with her felt fragile, like a thin thread that might snap at any moment. Her mind kept drifting back to the odd events of the evening. Jesse's strange phone call, the eerie silence that followed it, and the unease that had settled over the group. She couldn't explain it, but something wasn't right. With a sigh, Emma decided she needed to clear her head. She'd been in this house before, a dozen times, and nothing had ever made her feel like this. So what was it now? She pushed open the door to the guest room, the old hinges creaking in protest. A faint musty smell hit her as she stepped inside, the room cold despite the warmth of the night outside. The curtains fluttered softly, though the window was shut tight, adding to the strange, disjointed feeling in the air. At first glance, the room seemed ordinary enough. A simple bed, a few chairs, and an old dresser filled with knickknacks. Yet, there was a strange stillness about it, as if the room had been untouched for years. The walls were lined with old family photographs, smiling faces frozen in time. But no matter how many times Emma had stayed in this house, she never could get over how those eyes in the pictures seemed to follow her around the room. She shook off the feeling and walked further in, trying to push the disquiet aside. But then, she heard it. A whisper. At first, it was so soft that she thought she was imagining it. She turned, glancing back toward the door, half expecting one of her friends to be standing there, playing a prank. But no one was there, just the silence. Emma? The whisper came again, this time clearer, more distinct. The voice was a woman's, low and melodic, but strained, as if it were coming from far away. Emma froze, her heart leaping in her chest. She stepped backward, her eyes darting around the room. There was no one there. She moved toward the window, pushing aside the curtains to peer outside, hoping the voice was just some figment of her imagination. The night outside was thick with shadows, the trees outside swaying gently in the breeze, but there was nothing that could explain the voice. Her pulse raced. Emma turned back toward the center of the room, but that's when she noticed something. The shadows in the corners of the room, they weren't right. They were moving, twisting and shifting in the corners of her vision, as though something was trying to break free from the walls themselves. Her breath hitched in her throat as she stepped closer, unable to tear her eyes away from the corners where the shadows seemed to pulse, to writhe. She reached out with trembling fingers, trying to touch the wall near the shadowy corner, hoping to dispel the eerie feeling that had settled over her. But the moment her fingers brushed against the wall, she felt it. A coldness, far colder than the room itself. It was like touching ice. The shadows seemed to elongate as her fingers made contact, crawling along the floor like ink spilled in water. Her heart hammered in her chest. She stepped back quickly, colliding with the dresser. A loud bang echoed through the room, but Emma barely registered it as her attention was locked on the corner where the shadows were thickening, where the whispering voice had come from. "Emma?" The voice called again, this time sounding closer, almost as if it was inside the room with her. Panic surged through Emma, and she spun around, desperate to escape, to leave the room. But her legs felt like lead. The door, just a few feet away, seemed miles distant now, like an insurmountable distance. The shadows seemed to reach for her, their fingers stretching across the room toward her. The voice continuing to echo, growing louder with each breath she took. Suddenly, the shadows in the corner of the room split, revealing a figure. At first, it was just a vague shape, tall and slim, outlined by the creeping darkness. But as it stepped closer, the air seemed to grow colder, and the figure's features became clearer. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one, but her face was obscured by a dark veil, her eyes hidden in the folds of shadow. Her clothes were old-fashioned, the fabric torn and faded, and there was a strange, unnatural stillness to her movements as she advanced slowly toward Emma. Emma tried to scream, but no sound came. Her throat tightened, as if something was pressing down on it, squeezing the air from her lungs. She stumbled backward, her hands outstretched, her breath shallow. The figure continued moving toward her, silent, relentless, its presence filling the room like a suffocating fog. "Get out," Emma whispered to herself, trying to force her feet to move, but they wouldn't obey. It was like being trapped in a nightmare where the harder you tried to run, the more you were pulled into the terror. The shadowy figure stopped just inches away from Emma, its veiled face still hidden in darkness. But then, in the silence that followed, the whispers returned. Only now they weren't just calling her name. They were laughing softly, menacingly. The sound echoed in her ears, growing louder until it was all she could hear. Her eyes widened in terror as the figure reached out toward her, its long, cold fingers brushing against her skin. In that moment, Emma felt a chill so deep, so profound, that it seemed to reach into her very soul. She finally found her voice, letting out a scream that was swallowed by the shadows. The moment before she could flee, the figure reached out to touch her, and the room seemed to lurch. Everything went dark. The house was still, save for the occasional creak of the floorboards and the faint hum of the old refrigerator in the kitchen downstairs. Jessie sat on the bed, her back pressed against the headboard, her mind swirling with the events of the night. The phone call, the strange shadows, Mia's disappearance into the attic. It felt like the house was alive with secrets, each one lurking in the corners, waiting to be uncovered. The air was thick with a sense of impending doom, and Jessie couldn't shake the feeling that someone, was watching her. She glanced over at the window, her eyes narrowing as she noticed the shadows outside shifting unnaturally. The night was unusually quiet, and the wind had died down to a whisper, but the trees outside seemed to sway as if moved by invisible hands. The house, though full of strange noises, felt eerily silent at the moment, and it was unsettling. Jessie tried to shake off the anxiety, her friends' voices still faintly echoing from the living room. It was supposed to be a fun night, a sleepover like any other. Yet, every passing minute made the house feel more oppressive. Suddenly, a loud crash broke the stillness. Jessie jumped to her feet, her heart racing in her chest. The sound had come from outside, the unmistakable noise of glass shattering. Her breath caught in her throat as she moved to the window, peering through the curtains, but she could see nothing. Her pulse pounded in her ears as she quickly pulled the curtains aside, staring out into the darkness. There was no sign of anything that could have caused the noise. No branch had fallen, no animal had wandered too close. It was as if the night itself had shattered. Her mind raced as she turned, looking over her shoulder at the door. She had heard it, 2 footsteps, slow and deliberate, just outside the room. The sound was too faint to be anything other than human, and Jessie's heart leapt into her throat. Someone was outside. But who? And how had they gotten in? She crept toward the door, each step slow and measured, her hands trembling as she reached for the handle. The house had so many creaks and groans, but the silence beyond her door was suffocating. She stood still for a moment, listening. The footsteps had stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. There was only one other way out of the room, the window. Her mind was spinning as she slowly approached the window, her eyes scanning the dark yard below. The moon was barely visible through the heavy clouds, casting everything in an eerie, silvery glow. There was something unnerving about the way the trees stood still in the night, as if they were holding their breath, waiting. Jessie's stomach churned as she glanced downward. The window wasn't just cracked, it was shattered, the glass shards scattered across the ground below. Her pulse quickened as her eyes searched the yard. It looked abandoned, empty, but then something moved. A shadow. It was quick, just a flicker at the edge of the yard, but it was enough to send a rush of cold through Jessie's veins. It was almost as if the figure had been waiting there for her to look, watching her in silence, blending into the darkness. The sound of footsteps behind her made Jessie's heart nearly stop. She spun around, expecting to see one of her friends, but the room was empty. Her breath was shallow as she moved back to the window, trying to make sense of what she had seen. The shadow had vanished. Just then, the phone rang again, its shrill, piercing sound cutting through the stillness of the room. Jessie hesitated, the hairs on the back of her neck standing on end. She was tired of the strange calls, tired of feeling like she was losing control of everything. Her hand hovered over the receiver, then slowly picked it up. She pressed it to her ear, her fingers trembling. "Hello." Her voice was shaky, barely a whisper. There was a long pause before the voice on the other end replied, low and cold. "You shouldn't have looked outside, Jessie." Jessie's heart dropped into her stomach. She didn't even have time to react before the voice continued. "Turn around." The line went dead. The words hung in the air like a promise, chilling and final. Jessie's body went stiff, and she slowly turned toward the door. The feeling of dread that had been creeping up her spine suddenly exploded, and she knew. She wasn't alone in the room anymore. The temperature in the room had dropped, the warmth from the heater no longer enough to push back the growing cold. The air felt heavy, suffocating. Jessie's breath came out in visible puffs, the room somehow feeling smaller, more confining with each passing second. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A figure, tall, thin, and twisted, stood in the farthest corner of the room, its back to her. It was watching her, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Jessie's heart pounded in her chest as she took a step backward, her legs shaking. She didn't know whether to scream or run, but every instinct in her body screamed, "Get out." The figure remained still, unmoving, as if waiting for her to make the next move. Jessie's mind raced. It was no longer a question of whether or not something was wrong. It was a matter of how long she could stand this horror before it consumed her. "Jessie," the voice called, not from the phone, but from the figure itself. The figure slowly turned toward her. Its face was obscured by shadows, but Jessie could see the gleam of pale eyes reflecting the dim light. A low, guttural laugh escaped the figure's mouth, and Jessie's blood ran cold. You shouldn't have looked outside, it whispered again. The figure took a step forward, and Jessie's heart leapt into her throat. She spun around and ran for the door, not daring to look back. As she slammed the door open, the figure's voice echoed behind her. You'll never escape. The hallway stretched out before her like a tunnel, the shadows at either end pulling her in. She could hear her heart thundering in her chest, the panic surging with each step she took toward the stairs. She had to find her friends. She had to leave. But as she rushed down the hallway, the unmistakable sound of footsteps echoed right behind her, growing louder, closer. It wasn't just following her anymore. It was chasing her. The house had become a labyrinth of shadows and whispers, a place where nothing felt familiar anymore. Jessie's mind swirled with unanswered questions and the feeling that something, or someone, was toying with her. The night, once filled with the comforting sounds of laughter and chatter, now seemed to echo with silence, heavy and suffocating. She had tried to go downstairs, to find her friends and feel some semblance of normalcy, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something lurking just beyond her vision, something waiting to catch her in its web. The phone call had rattled her to her core, more so than the shadows or the footsteps or even the figure that had appeared in her room. The voice on the other end had been cold, methodical, and, most chilling of all, too familiar. Jessie's hands trembled as she placed the phone back on its receiver, her mind replaying the cryptic words. You shouldn't have looked outside, Jessie. Who was it? The voice hadn't sounded like anyone she knew. It was as if it came from a place far beyond the walls of the house, distant yet intimate, like a dark presence that had been following her for much longer than she realized. The words didn't just haunt her. They taunted her, suggesting a kind of knowledge, a deep connection with her that she couldn't comprehend. The way it had spoken to her, it was as though the caller knew everything about her, even things she hadn't told anyone. The fear that gripped her heart was palpable now, suffocating her every thought. She had to get out, but the house was no longer a safe place. The walls seemed to close in on her, the air growing thick with dread. Jessie took a step back from the phone, almost as if afraid that picking it up again would summon something worse. Suddenly, the phone rang again. It was like a punch to her chest. The shrill sound reverberated through the room, causing her heart to lurch in her throat. She stood frozen, staring at the device as if it were some kind of cursed object, a portal to something terrible. The seconds ticked by slowly, the ringing echoing in her mind, each ring louder than the last. She should ignore it, she thought. She should walk away, forget this night, forget the feeling of being hunted. But she couldn't. Something inside her urged her to pick it up, to answer, as if the phone held the answers to the madness swirling around her. With trembling hands, Jessie reached out and lifted the receiver to her ear. The room was dead silent except for the pounding of her own heart. She could hear her breath coming in shallow gasps, the cold sweat collecting on her skin. She waited, her stomach in knots, as the phone crackled in her ear. Hello? Her voice sounded small, unsure, almost like she was pleading for some kind of reassurance. The line was silent for a moment. Then, without warning, the voice returned, but this time it was different. It was closer, intimate, as though the person was standing right beside her. I told you not to look outside, Jessie, the voice whispered, slow and deliberate, each word dripping with malice. Jessie's grip on the phone tightened. Who are you? She demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and defiance. She wasn't going to let this thing control her. Not anymore. There was a pause on the other end, a long, drawn-out silence that stretched like an eternity. Jessie could feel her own breath grow shallow as she waited for an answer, her fingers growing numb against the receiver. The air around her felt thick with anticipation, the silence almost deafening. You really don't remember, do you? The voice finally replied, its tone oddly patient, as if speaking to a child who didn't understand the weight of their actions. You never saw me, but I've been there, watching. I've always been watching. The blood drained from Jessie's face as the words sank in. Watching. Who was this person? How could they know her like this? She tried to speak, to demand answers, but her voice caught in her throat. A cold chill spread over her skin, and for the first time, Jessie felt truly vulnerable, exposed in a way she couldn't explain. It was as though this person knew her deepest secrets, knew every corner of her mind, every fear she had ever buried. The voice continued, "You think you're safe, don't you? That if you stay here, if you pretend nothing is wrong, it will all go away. But it never does, Jessie. It never goes away." Jessie's heart pounded in her chest, the words echoing in her mind. It was impossible to breathe. The walls felt like they were closing in on her. She couldn't escape the feeling that she was being suffocated by some unseen force. She took a step back, the phone still pressed to her ear, but the voice on the other end grew louder, more insistent. "I've been watching you for so long," the voice said, its tone almost affectionate, as if they were telling her a secret. "All those times you've been alone, when you thought you were safe, I've been right there, waiting, just watching." A sickening thought gripped Jessie's mind, and she felt the world tilt beneath her. Was it possible? Could the voice be right? Could this presence, whatever it was, have been with her all along, watching her in her most private moments? Her mind flashed back to the attic, the journal she had found, the mysterious child and the shadows. Mia had been there too, hadn't she? Hadn't they all heard something? Something that wasn't quite right? "No," Jessie whispered, her voice trembling as she tried to fight off the growing panic. "No, you're lying. You're just messing with me." The voice on the other end didn't respond at first, and for a moment Jessie thought she might have finally shaken it. But then the voice returned, softer, more menacing than before. "I'm not lying, Jessie. I'm already inside." The words sent a jolt of terror through her, as though the ground had fallen away beneath her feet. She stumbled backward, her body tingling with the shock of realization. Inside? What did that mean? Before she could process anything further, the phone line went dead with a sharp click. Jessie stood in the room, breathless and wide-eyed, the phone still pressed to her ear. The world seemed to stop around her, her mind reeling, unable to understand the full scope of what had just happened. As the seconds ticked by, Jessie's mind raced. What was she supposed to do now? She had to find the others. She had to tell them what was happening. They had to get out of the house before whatever this was trapped them here forever. But when she turned to leave, she heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and too close. The house had never felt more alive. Alive with secrets, alive with terror. The walls themselves seemed to be watching Jessie, their old, weathered faces staring back at her in the flickering light. She could feel every inch of the house now, every creak of the floorboards beneath her feet as she moved slowly down the darkened hallway. The phone call echoed in her mind, its cold words replaying over and over. "You're not alone, Jessie. I'm already inside." The voice had made it sound so simple, so calm, but the weight of it crushed her chest. She couldn't breathe. She had always believed that the house was old and creaky, an empty, forgotten space. But now, as she moved through the hallway, she saw it for what it truly was. A prison, one that had been waiting for her to stumble into its traps. Every corner seemed to hide something. Every shadow was too deep, too dark. And she knew something was there, watching, waiting. Jessie's fingers brushed along the wall as she moved, the chill in the air becoming unbearable. The hallway stretched endlessly before her, the faint light at the far end barely enough to cut through the darkness. She kept walking, unable to stop herself, her body acting on some primal instinct, urging her to move forward even though everything inside her screamed to run. It wasn't just the house that felt wrong now, it was the very air. There was something suffocating about the way the silence hung in the space around her, like a heavy fog. Each breath she took felt labored, as if she were inhaling something poisonous. The shadows in the hallway had begun to feel alive. They swirled around her, drawing closer, creeping in as though they were tightening their grip on her. Then, just as her heart began to pound in her chest, she saw it. A figure standing at the far end of the hall, partially obscured by the darkness. Jessie froze, her body rigid with fear. The figure didn't move. It stood still, its silhouette just barely visible in the low light. For a long moment, all she could do was stare, her breath caught in her throat. Was it one of her friends? She asked herself, though she immediately knew the answer. No, this wasn't one of them. She knew it. It wasn't just the way the figure stood, unnaturally still, unnervingly so. It was the feeling that radiated from it. A feeling of malice. A sense of something ancient, something that didn't belong in the house, something that had been waiting, watching. "Hello," Jessie whispered, her voice barely more than a tremor. Her mouth felt dry, her throat tight. The figure didn't respond. Her heart was thudding in her ears now, louder than the sound of her own breath. She took a hesitant step forward, her legs shaking beneath her. Another step, then another. But as she moved closer, the figure didn't move, didn't acknowledge her. It just stood there in the silence. Why wasn't it moving? The question echoed in her mind, and just as quickly, it hit her. She didn't want it to move. She didn't want to know what it was capable of. She just wanted to get away. But it was too late. The figure seemed to shift. The shadows around it moved as though they were one with the figure itself. And then, in an instant, it was no longer just a figure standing in the darkness. It was closer, so much closer. Jessie's breath caught in her throat as she tried to back away. But the hallway had suddenly seemed to stretch farther than she remembered. Her feet wouldn't move. They felt like they were rooted to the floor, as though the shadows had already claimed her. "Don't go," the voice whispered. But it wasn't the same voice from the phone. This voice was softer, almost coaxing. The tone was sweet, too sweet, like a lullaby sung in the dead of night. Jessie's mind raced, and she could feel the walls closing in around her. There was nowhere to go, nowhere to run. "Don't go," the voice repeated, this time with more insistence. Her heart was pounding now, every beat a drum in her chest. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run. But she couldn't. The figure was too close now. It had moved, shifted, until it stood right in front of her. Jessie's eyes widened, the darkness of the hallway consuming her vision. The figure no longer a distant silhouette, but a presence. Something she could feel pressing against her, enveloping her. It was a woman, or at least it looked like one, though her face was obscured in shadow, a veil of darkness that seemed to ripple and shift. The woman's hair was long, dark, and tangled, hanging down in strands like cobwebs. Her eyes were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to pull at the very light around her, absorbing it, swallowing it whole. Jessie opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out. She could feel the weight of the woman's gaze on her, could sense the deep, ancient hunger in the air. The woman's lips parted, revealing teeth, sharp, jagged teeth, like something not human, something that shouldn't be here. And then the woman smiled. It wasn't a smile of kindness or affection. It was a smile full of malice, full of hunger. Jessie's stomach churned, her fear overtaking every rational thought in her mind. She stumbled backward, but her legs were weak, and she fell to the floor with a loud thud. The shadows seemed to rush toward her, pressing down on her chest, suffocating her. The woman reached out, her fingers long and gnarled, her nails like claws, and just as Jessie screamed, just as she tried to scramble away, the woman's hand grabbed her wrist, pulling her closer. "Don't go," the voice cooed in her ear, the words ringing in her mind like a bell, deafening and final. Jessie's heart stopped. She couldn't breathe. There was no escape. The air inside the house had become thick, as though something had seeped into it, draining it of all warmth and light. Jessie's heart raced with every breath, each one shallow and desperate. The hallway had swallowed her whole, the shadows playing tricks on her eyes, the distant sounds of laughter and movement from the others downstairs now nothing more than faint echoes, drowned out by the growing heaviness in the house. She couldn't feel the ground beneath her feet anymore. It was like walking through a nightmare, her every step uncertain, her body betraying her with each turn, her mind desperate to make sense of the chaos unfolding around her. Jessie stumbled into the living room, her breath erratic, her mind spinning with the latest encounter. The woman in the hallway, The figure with the hollow eyes and jagged teeth had nearly claimed her. She was sure of it. But how could she have escaped? How had she found the strength to run? Her legs had felt like lead, her entire body shaking with fear. But still, she had managed to make it out. It didn't make sense. None of it did. The living room was dimly lit, the shadows in the corners creeping like fingers across the walls. She could feel the pressure in her chest, the weight of the unseen eyes that seemed to watch her, waiting. The mirror on the far wall caught her attention, its dark, polished surface reflecting the flickering light from the fireplace. Jessie couldn't help herself. Her eyes were drawn to it, as if something inside her was urging her to look. Her heart skipped a beat. She froze in place. The mirror was different. It wasn't the same one she remembered. There was something unnatural about it now. The reflection was distorted, twisted in a way that felt wrong. The edges of the mirror seemed to warp and ripple, like the surface of water disturbed by an unseen hand. The familiar living room that should have been reflected back at her looked darker. The light was dimmer. The shadows were more pronounced. And then Jessie saw it. The figure, standing behind her. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. The room was empty, save for the furniture and the flickering fire. Her heart pounded harder, her breath coming in short gasps. She turned back to the mirror, and there it was again, the figure. A dark shape, standing just out of reach, its presence so palpable that it seemed to stretch out from the surface of the glass and touch her. Jessie's stomach churned. The figure was tall and thin, its outline barely visible through the distortion of the mirror, but its presence was undeniable. She couldn't see its face, but there was something about the way it stood, so still, so silent, that made her blood run cold. She couldn't tear her eyes away from it. She didn't want to, but she couldn't stop herself. The figure, the reflection, it wasn't just standing there anymore. It was moving. Slowly, methodically, it took a step closer and then another. The reflection didn't mimic her movements. It was something else, something more sinister. Jessie felt her heart lurch in her chest. She took a hesitant step back, but the figure in the mirror took a step forward. The reflection mirrored her fear, moving closer to her with each breath she took. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold surface of the glass, feeling the icy chill that seemed to radiate from it. "Stop," she whispered to herself. "This isn't real." But the reflection in the mirror didn't stop. It moved closer. The outline of the figure became sharper, its limbs elongated, its body stretching unnaturally as it leaned toward her. Jessie's pulse raced, and she tried to pull away, but her body wouldn't obey. She was paralyzed, her mind locked in a battle between logic and fear. It was just a reflection. It had to be. Yet, the figure in the mirror was growing stronger, more defined. The air around Jessie became colder, her breath visible in the freezing atmosphere. It was as though the mirror had become a window, a portal, and the reflection was reaching through to her. Her breath hitched as the figure's face slowly emerged from the shadows. It wasn't the hollow eyes of the woman in the hallway. It was worse. The face was blurred, shifting in and out of focus, like the face of something that had never truly belonged to the world. It was a mess of distortion. Too many eyes, too many mouths, stretching and bending in unnatural ways. It was a face that should never be seen. Jessie stumbled backward, gasping for air, her legs buckling beneath her. She couldn't take her eyes off the mirror. The face continued to shift, the features becoming more grotesque, more alien with every second. The reflection didn't just stand there anymore. It was watching her. It was moving toward her, reaching out, its twisted fingers reaching through the glass, slowly, inch by inch, toward her. No, she had to get out of here. She had to leave, but her legs refused to move. It was as though the mirror had a hold on her, its pull stronger than anything she had ever felt before. Jessie's heart hammered in her chest as the figure in the mirror reached out, its hand stretching toward her with a sickening slowness. "Help me!" Jessie cried out, her voice breaking as she looked desperately toward the doorway, but no one came. There was no one to hear her. The reflection's fingers reached the glass, And in that moment, the entire room seemed to shudder. The mirror's surface rippled like water disturbed by a stone. Jessie felt a sudden sharp pain in her chest, as if something were pulling her, grabbing her, from the other side. Her body was no longer her own. She could feel the coldness, the grip of something reaching through, something from another world. Desperately, Jessie tried to pull away, but the pain intensified, spreading from her chest to her limbs, as though the mirror had become a physical presence, pulling her into its depths. She gasped, her mind overwhelmed by the sharp, jagged sensation. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. The mirror was still. The figure had vanished. Jessie collapsed to the floor, her heart racing in her chest. She couldn't understand what had just happened. The reflection had been real, she knew it had. The feeling, the coldness, the presence, it was all too real. And yet, when she looked up again, the mirror seemed just as it had been before. Dark, quiet, and still. The figure was gone, but the lingering sense of something having passed through, of something having touched her, remained. Jessie's mind was a storm of confusion, fear, and growing despair as she stumbled back from the mirror, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The figure had vanished, but the feeling, the oppressive weight of something dark, something ancient, lingered in the room. She wanted to scream, to call out, but the words caught in her throat, as if the house itself was swallowing her sound. Everything had changed. The walls seemed to pulse. The shadows felt deeper, more alive. The house wasn't just a place anymore. It was a living entity, watching her, waiting. She turned, her eyes desperately searching for a way out, but there was no escape. The hallway stretched before her like an endless tunnel. Every step she took felt heavier, as if the house itself was weighing her down, pulling her further into its depths. She glanced around, trying to find some semblance of safety, and that's when she saw it. The staircase leading up to the attic. The attic. She had always avoided the attic. Everyone had. It was said to be full of old, forgotten things. Dusty boxes, broken furniture, forgotten memories. But there was something about it now, something drawing her toward it. Jessie's mind screamed at her to leave, to get out of the house, to find her friends and run as far away as possible. But her feet moved before she could make the choice, carrying her toward the staircase with a mind of its own. Each step creaked under her weight as she ascended the narrow stairs, the air growing colder with every inch she climbed. The house felt different up here, smaller, more confining. The walls seemed to close in, the dim light from the hallway fading the higher she went. The shadows seemed to stretch and warp around her, like dark fingers reaching out to pull her in. Her heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last as she reached the top of the stairs. The attic door stood before her, slightly ajar, an unnatural chill seeping from the crack. The air inside was thick with dust, heavy with the scent of mildew and neglect. Jessie hesitated, standing frozen at the threshold. Her hand hovered over the door, her mind filled with conflicting thoughts. Should I really go in? The question echoed in her mind, but the door was already opening, almost as if it were beckoning her inside. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet as she stepped into the attic. The room was dim, the only light coming from a small, flickering bulb overhead that cast long, jagged shadows across the space. Dust hung in the air, particles floating like ghosts in the weak light. The walls were lined with old trunks, dusty boxes, and faded furniture. There were forgotten relics of a time long past, things that no one had cared to touch in years. But it wasn't the furniture, nor the old boxes that caught her attention. It was something in the far corner of the room, something dark, something that shouldn't be there. The figure. The figure was hunched over, its body twisted and unnatural, as if it had been crammed into the corner for years. Jessie's eyes locked onto it, her breath freezing in her chest. She couldn't see its face. Its features were obscured by shadow, but she could feel it watching her, its presence so overwhelming that it seemed to pulse through the very air around her. She should have turned back. She should have left. But something, some deep, primal instinct urged her forward. She took one slow step after another, her legs moving of their own accord, her eyes never leaving the dark shape in the corner. Her heart hammered in her chest as she drew closer, the room growing colder with every step. And then, as if sensing her approach, the figure stirred. Jessie froze. Her body went rigid, her breath caught in her throat. The figure was moving, slowly, its limbs twisted and contorted, the sound of bones cracking and shifting filling the silent room. It was like watching something wake up from a long, unnatural slumber, its movements jerky and disjointed, as though it hadn't moved in years. She wanted to scream, to run, to get away, but the figure was already turning toward her. Slowly, impossibly slowly, its head lifted from the shadows, revealing a face that was not a face at all. The skin was stretched too tightly over its skull, pale and sickly, its eyes wide and glassy, hollow like black voids that seemed to swallow all the light in the room. Its mouth stretched into a grotesque smile, the lips cracking as it grinned at her. Jessie's blood ran cold. She stepped back, her body trembling with fear, but the figure began to move again. Its legs stretched unnaturally long, its body contorting in ways that defied the laws of nature. It took a slow, deliberate step toward her, each movement sending waves of terror through Jessie's body. Her mind screamed at her to run, to escape, but her legs wouldn't move. The figure came closer, its black eyes locked on hers, its smile widening, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. It was coming for her. "Help!" Jessie screamed, her voice hoarse and raw, but there was no one to hear her. The house was silent, empty, suffocating. The figure reached out, its hands stretching toward her with unnatural speed, the long fingers reaching out like claws. Jessie's instincts finally kicked in. She turned and ran, stumbling over the old furniture, her feet sliding on the dusty floorboards. The figure's laughter, low, guttural and unnatural, echoed behind her, the sound vibrating in her chest, in her bones. She raced down the stairs, the sound of her own frantic footsteps blending with the shrill laughter that followed her. She didn't dare look back. She couldn't. But the attic door slammed shut behind her, as if the house itself was trapping her in its grip. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop running. She couldn't. But the shadows were closing in, pressing in on her, suffocating her every step. The house was alive, and it was hunting her. Jessie's heart was still racing as she stood at the bottom of the stairs, gasping for air, her body trembling with fear. She had barely escaped the attic, barely escaped whatever it was that had been waiting for her up there. The house had shifted again, become even more oppressive, more suffocating. It was as if the walls themselves had begun to close in around her, squeezing the air out of her lungs. Her legs felt weak, as if the very essence of the house was draining her strength. She didn't know what was happening anymore, or why she was still here. All she wanted was to leave, to escape from this nightmare. But the house didn't want her to leave. The air in the hallway was thick, heavy with the weight of something unspoken, something ancient. Jessie moved slowly down the hall, each step reluctant, as though the floor itself was pulling her in. She had to find the others, Mia, Olivia, and the others, but where were they? Why hadn't they come looking for her? She hadn't heard a single sound from the living room, no footsteps, no voices. It was as if they had all disappeared. Jessie's breath caught in her throat. The house had always been old, always had its quirks. The creaking floors, the strange echoes, the way the rooms never quite felt right. But this was different. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. It felt like the house was alive, as if it had a mind of its own, and it was drawing her in. Her eyes flicked to the walls, the wallpaper peeling in places, the faint traces of mold staining the edges of the baseboards. But there was something else, something she hadn't noticed before. Soft, indistinct whispers, low and garbled, seemed to emanate from the very walls themselves. The sound was faint at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder, more distinct, as if something was speaking directly to her from within the walls. Her heart skipped a beat. She pressed her hand to the wall, her fingers trembling, her pulse quickening. The whispers seemed to be coming from every direction now, surrounding her, suffocating her. She couldn't understand the words. They were too jumbled, too distorted, like they were being spoken underwater. But the tone was unmistakable, dark, ominous, full of malice. She pulled her hand back quickly, as though the wall had burned her. Felt wrong. The house felt wrong. Jessie spun around, her eyes scanning the hallway, but the whispering continued. It was as if the house was alive, breathing, speaking to her through its cracks, through its old bones. "Help me." The voice whispered again, more clearly this time. Jessie's stomach twisted at the sound. The voice was unmistakably human, but it was distorted, like it was coming from somewhere far away, somewhere deep within the earth. She took a step back, but the whispering seemed to follow her, creeping along the walls, curling around her, closing in. Her skin crawled with the sensation of invisible eyes watching her from every angle. Jessie's heart thudded painfully in her chest as the whispers grew louder, more insistent, more demanding. "Help me. It's your fault." The words sent a chill down her spine. The voice, though still garbled, was becoming clearer now, and Jessie could almost make out the words, but they didn't make sense. It was like listening to a broken record, words repeating in a loop, growing more frantic with each pass. "It's your fault. It's your fault." Jessie's knees nearly buckled beneath her, and she had to brace herself against the wall to stay upright. The air felt too thick to breathe, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to sway as though the house itself was alive, shifting, twisting. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, but it was impossible. The whispers had become a chorus now, swirling around her. Inside her, each voice distinct, yet all overlapping, forming a terrifying cacophony that made her head ache. Then, without warning, the whispering stopped. Silence. The sudden absence of sound was even more deafening than the whispers had been. Jessie stood frozen, her chest heaving with shallow breaths, unsure of what was happening, where to go. She felt lightheaded, disoriented, as though the ground beneath her feet was no longer solid. The house seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something. And then she heard it. A faint sound, so quiet it was almost imperceptible at first, but growing louder with each passing second. The sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway behind her. Jessie's heart leaped into her throat. She spun around, her eyes wide, searching for the source of the sound. But there was nothing. No one. The hallway was empty, stretching into the darkness, the shadows pressing in from all sides. The footsteps stopped, and then the voice returned, this time from directly behind her. It was so close, Jessie could feel the breath on the back of her neck. "You shouldn't have come back." The words were not a whisper this time. They were clear, unmistakable, spoken in a voice that was both familiar and foreign, gentle yet menacing. Jessie felt a cold chill run through her, and she turned quickly, her body stiff with terror, her eyes locking onto the figure standing in the doorway at the end of the hall. It was her. The woman. The one from the attic. The one whose twisted face had haunted her since the moment she had seen it. But this time the woman wasn't smiling. She wasn't even moving. She was just standing there, her eyes fixed on Jessie, her expression cold, emotionless. Jessie opened her mouth to scream, but the words wouldn't come. She couldn't speak, couldn't breathe. The figure in the doorway stepped forward, and with each step it took, the whispers began again, growing louder, swirling around Jessie, clawing at her mind. "It's your fault." Jessie stumbled backward, her body shaking uncontrollably. She couldn't stop herself. Her feet moved, dragging her away from the woman, down the hallway, away from the oppressive force that seemed to be closing in around her. But no matter how fast she ran, the footsteps behind her grew louder. The whispers in the walls, the voice in her ear, everything was collapsing in on her. And through it all, the woman's cold eyes remained fixed on her, unblinking. The house had become a prison, a maze of shadows and whispers. Jessie's mind was spinning. Each corner she turned more oppressive than the last, the air thicker with each breath. It was as if the walls themselves had grown hostile, pressing in on her, keeping her contained within their dark embrace. Every step felt heavier than the last, and the ever-growing sense of dread threatened to swallow her whole. She couldn't think straight anymore. The phone call, the figure in the attic, the whispering voices in the walls. It was all starting to blur together, like a nightmare she couldn't wake up from. Every part of her being screamed for escape, but the house had become a maze with no exit. She didn't know where the others were anymore. Mia, Olivia, they were all gone, or maybe they'd never been there to begin with. The more Jessie tried to piece things together, the more fragmented her thoughts became. It felt as though the house was erasing her memories, one piece at a time. And then, as she moved deeper into the hallway, she saw it. A shadow at the end of the corridor, standing still, waiting. Her heart skipped a beat, her breath caught in her throat. It was impossible to tell whether it was just another trick of the light, but it was real enough for her to freeze in place. The figure was tall, looming, and there was something unnatural about the way it stood. It didn't breathe, didn't move. It was just there, a dark presence, one that seemed to absorb the very light around it. For a moment, Jessie thought she might be imagining it, that perhaps the exhaustion, the fear, had finally taken its toll. But then the figure moved, slowly, deliberately. Every step it took was measured, controlled, like it was savoring the terror it was about to unleash. Jessie didn't wait for it to come closer. She turned and bolted, running down the hallway as fast as her legs would carry her, the sound of her rapid footsteps echoing through the empty house. But no matter how fast she ran, the air around her grew colder, the shadows longer, and the whispering voices, those damned voices, seemed to follow her, growing louder, more insistent. "It's your fault?" The words followed her like a curse, the voices intertwining, crawling inside her head, making her mind splinter. She pressed her hands to her ears, but the voices continued, seeping into her skin, coating her insides with their poison. She couldn't escape them. She couldn't escape the house. It was everywhere, inside of her, around her. She could feel the house itself breathing, pulsing like a heart, and she was its prisoner. Suddenly, she found herself at the foot of the staircase again, the stairs leading up to the attic. The very same stairs she had climbed earlier, when she had found the figure, when she had felt the pull of the house drawing her into the attic's depths. She stopped, her body trembling, her mind racing. She couldn't go up there again. The attic was where it had all started. The whispers, the figure, the terrible feeling of being trapped in something far beyond her control. But there was nowhere else to go. Jessie hesitated, her legs refusing to move, as if they knew that what lay ahead would only bring more terror. But she had no choice. The footsteps behind her, the whispering voices in the walls, the oppressive darkness. It was all closing in. She had to move. She had to find out what was happening, or she would lose her sanity entirely. Her feet moved before her mind could stop them, and she found herself climbing the stairs again, the wood creaking beneath her weight. With each step, the air grew colder, the darkness more suffocating. She could feel the weight of it pressing down on her, could feel the house watching her, waiting for her to descend deeper into its grasp. When she reached the top of the stairs, the attic door was already open, just like before, the darkness beyond it impenetrable. Jessie could hear something inside, something moving, scraping against the walls, dragging itself through the dust. She stepped forward, her body stiff with fear, and with one last hesitant glance behind her, she entered the attic. It was colder up here, colder than anything she had ever felt, as though the very air had frozen into ice. The light from the bulb above flickered weakly, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. The attic looked the same as it had when she first entered it. The same broken furniture, the same forgotten relics, the same sense of suffocating silence. But something was different now. The figure was there again. Only this time it wasn't standing still. It was moving, crawling on all fours, its body twisting and contorting in unnatural ways, dragging itself across the floor toward her. Its eyes, hollow and dark, were fixed on her, and its mouth, its jagged, gaping mouth, was opening wider and wider, revealing rows of teeth that seemed to stretch down its throat. Jessie couldn't move. Her body was frozen in terror, her heart hammering in her chest as the thing crawled closer, closer, its sharp claws scraping against the wooden floor. "You shouldn't have come back," it whispered, its voice low and guttural, reverberating through the room. Jessie's blood ran cold, the words sinking into her like ice, numbing her, freezing her to the spot. She wanted to scream, but no sound came out. The thing lunged at her. Jessie's instincts kicked in, and she stumbled backward, falling to the floor with a scream. Her hands scrambled for anything to hold on to, anything to stop herself from being dragged into the darkness. But there was nothing. The thing was upon her now, its cold hands reaching for her, pulling her closer into its horrific embrace. Its breath, foul and ragged, filled her senses as it loomed over her. Its face, if it could be called a face, contorted into something far worse than anything she had seen before. The house, the thing inside it, was pulling her in, dragging her deeper, suffocating her with every breath. She was going to be consumed by it, and the thought of that, of being swallowed whole by whatever lived in this cursed house, was the final piece that broke her mind. And then, just as the creature's hands closed around her throat, everything went black.